You're listening to Addiction Medicine Beyond the Abstract, the official podcast of the Journal of Addiction Medicine. If this is your first time listening, thanks for coming. Addiction Medicine Beyond the Abstract is produced for your enjoyment and is focused on the latest journal-published research and science in the field of addiction medicine. Remember to add us to your favorites in iTunes, and you can also follow us on Twitter at ASAM.org and Facebook. Now, let's go beyond the abstract. Welcome back. We're sitting down with Dr. Marcela Smid, who is here with us at the 56th Annual Conference. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me, Doctor.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm really looking forward to talking to you. I want to talk a little bit about peer review and submission for some new authors. So let's start with this. The process of submission and peer review, it can be challenging to navigate, especially for those new authors. This was the topic of your session, From Submission to Success, Insider Tips for Getting Your Addiction Content Published. So tell me, how do you demystify the process for scientific publishing for new authors?
Yeah, it can be very challenging when you haven't done it before to understand what are the do's and the don'ts to really moving your manuscript from writing it to then submission to actually what you want, which is publication. And the process really is like the first thing, and in our session we repeated, it really was about 10 times, like, read the instructions. I cannot emphasize how important it is to read the journal's instructions. That is so important, down to like formatting. I mean, you really want to make sure that you are reading it line by line and making sure that you are doing exactly what that journal wants you to do, because every journal is a little bit different. I mean, we talked a little bit about setting it to the right place. You want to make sure you're picking the right journal and then reading. One thing that I do is I always find, if I'm writing a paper and I pick a journal that I think is going to be good, I find a paper that is similar to something that I am writing and see how is that structured. What are the things that they want to highlight? So for example, for the Journal of Addiction Medicine, we're really aimed at clinicians. We want to publish things that are clinically useful. We're not going to accept basic science or translational research. It's just not within the scope of what we're publishing. It doesn't mean that it's not good science. It's just not what our journal is aimed at. So reading the instructions, following them extremely closely, down to things that seem, I think, are like minutia, but are so important. Like, make sure that your references are structured in the way that we tell you to. Double space your lines. Put line numbers on there. That is super important. Then when you get your feedback, right? So let's say you've submitted, you get the feedback, we respond, we send it out for reviews. We are finding, so I think it's important to demystify, reviewers are all volunteers. Nobody is paid to do your review. It is just, it's a person who could be here that's reading your paper and giving you critical feedback. And it's never a criticism of you as a researcher. It's always giving feedback to make your paper better, and really accepting that when you get those reviews back, even if, for example, it's a rejection, you've still gotten good feedback. I mean, we have great reviewers. Reviewers are being thoughtful. They're only agreeing to do it. I mean, I can't tell you the number of people that decline to review articles that I send out. And so if they're volunteering it, they're volunteering their time to give you that feedback. So even if you get a rejection, that can turn around and you can submit it to the next journal, but you really want to pay attention to that feedback.
Awesome. I know you've said before, and this is kind of talking about some of that feedback, you've said that reviewers are trying to help your manuscript. They have been selected by editors to provide expert feedback. Paying close attention to their comments is critical. Even if you don't agree, it's critically important to respond to each comment. So tell me, in your own experience, have you received a comment that you disagreed with? And if so, what did you do in that situation? And what advice would you offer others on how to handle that type of situation?
Yeah, so I think if you've submitted a manuscript, you've probably gotten feedback from a reviewer that you might not necessarily agree with, or they're asking for clarification. You're like, well, how can I make this any clearer? Or their interpretation of the data is different than yours. What is critically important to all reviewers is always to be respectful.
Okay.
You really want to avoid being dismissive or defensive. And the way to do that is really the way that you structure your response, is to say, like, we thank the reviewer for their thoughtful comment, right? And that even puts you into that into that mindset, because this is an emotional process. We are all emotional beings. When someone says something, you have reactions, right? So in our session, we talked about, like, take time to do this. Like, sometimes you are angry at the comments that you receive. So do not respond. Do not angry text. That is a bad idea.
Right, yeah.
Right? You got to take time. Maybe write, if you're a person that writes it out, but don't send it, right? You put that in the parking
Smart,
lot.
yeah.
And then you really want to respond to every single comment and say, like, thank you for the thoughtful comment. If you think that they misinterpreted, you can say, well, our interpretation is this, and then you back it up with whatever your comment is. I have certainly had reviewers come back and say, like, well, I think that this is wrong or misinterpreted or something like that. And then you want to really sit there and say, like, and be critical, like, evaluate yourself. Like, is there a different way of interpreting this? Could this be looked at in a different way or in a different lens? And then you want to incorporate, really, if you can, incorporate that into your discussion or even into your limitations. Sometimes you're just like, this, and there are reviewers that just blatantly I do not agree with this. And a lot of times your editors can see that as well, right? You can see that as well. So you can have conversations if there's questions. You submit your cover letter with each of your responses. And if there is really something very contentious, like, we are reasonable human beings that want to move things through the process. And if there is a question, you can always correspond with your editor.
That's awesome. I want to shift gears a little bit because we're talking about research and the quality of research. So tell me, when it comes to that, the quality of research, how does funding play a role in that?
Funding is really important to disclose. So it's part of that, read the instructions, make sure that every journal, including the Journal of Addiction Medicine, is going to have a funding and disclosure section. So you want to say how you were funded, if you got any funding. A lot of times there's no funding. But if you have any funding, grant funding, you want to disclose that. And then if it's really important if there's industry funding or if there's any involvement in industry and like to what extent they were involved. There's lots of different ways that industry can be involved. So I've personally been involved in industry where they are conducting the study, right? They are doing the study. They wrote the protocol, they wrote the thing, and you are conducting the study with them as part of really their research team, which has a different flavor. And there are biases to that. There are biases to interpretation. There are, industry is industry. There is a capitalistic lens to it. And so that's why it's super important to disclose that and say, these are the ways in which industry was or was not involved. Sometimes industry is just providing the product, right? And they aren't involved in the scientific process, but they donate, for example, whatever it is that your medication or device or whatever it is that you're investigating. And it's important to say that as well, that they donated it, but they weren't part of the data gathering, analysis, or interpretation of the results. So it's just important to be, and both of those have a role, right? That doesn't mean that industry can't do good science. That's not true at all. Industry can and does do great science. And it is important to acknowledge that they have a bias. Everybody has a bias. Everybody comes to something with their own intentions and goals. And so it's just important to really disclose what is going on. And sometimes, I have disclosures because I am involved in certain industry studies, but it's important to say, like, well, for example, some of my institution receives funding from Organon to do postpartum hemorrhage research because I'm a maternal fetal medicine doc as well as an addiction medicine doc. Well, my postpartum hemorrhage device research isn't going to be relevant to my addiction research, but you still disclose it. So even if those are not relevant, right, you can say not relevant to this work, I have these affiliations, and you always want to disclose. So it's important to just talk about what the funding sources are so that people can situate it within the landscape of what is happening.
Right. So there's another question here, and this is an interesting one, I think, and I'm curious about your response to this one. AI. And how it kind of relates to this particular field that we're talking about with research and scientific research and all. How do you think that the sharing of scientific knowledge is going to change or evolve with the use of AI? What have you seen and what do you think is coming down the line?
So this was part of our talk. So part of our presentation, we talked about AI. So it is the new hot thing, right? So I would divide it into two, and we talked about this in our session, divide it into two different buckets. So you've got AI for helping with writing, right? So generative AI helping to write papers. It's really important. It can be very time-saving. It really does save time when you use it. It's a tool just like any other. So I think it can be appropriate. You definitely want to disclose anytime that you're using it. You want to disclose that you have used it and for what purpose. And then it's not a substitute. It can save you time. So for example, nothing terrifies me more than a blank page. I cannot write with a blank page. It is like absolutely writer's block for me. So I like to start with something. And so AI can really help somebody in that situation, like summarize this for me, but then you really have to go through and validate everything, make sure they're saying it in the way that it's accurate, it's valid, the citations are valid. And then the other thing to be really careful about is it can repeat stigmatizing language, which is so important it can exacerbate racial and ethnic disparities. It can by embedding language that is biased, especially for addiction. For our journal, you have to use person-centered language. We will absolutely reject it if you are not using person-centered language. So it's not a replacement for your writing. It just saves you time in a different place. And you want to, so things like ChatGPT, these chatbots, they aren't authors, but you should acknowledge them in your acknowledgments that you did use that. And if you're using your figure, right? If you develop a figure, AI can make beautiful figures, really fantastic figures that help to like crystallize what you're trying to get across. But you have to acknowledge it that this figure was created by AI. And then the other side is it being used as a research tool itself. And so I think there's really exciting research that is happening with AI being used to look at, like, if you take all of this information, what does AI take from this information? And how is that different, similar to, or how can it augment a human? And so it's important to discuss that in your methods. Like if you use it as a methodology, it's critically important with any methodology to like really talk about it and how it was used and how it wasn't used and what its advantages and limitations are. So those, I think, are that it's here to stay.
Yeah.
AI is here to stay. I heard not too long ago that it's not that AI is going to take your job. The person who can use AI better is going to take your job. And so it's not something that we should be afraid of. It's something that we have to acknowledge is a tool just like any other, and we have to acknowledge it, and we have to talk about what its advantages and disadvantages are, what are its benefits and limitations, both as a writing tool and as a research tool.
Sure. Lot of great information packed into this episode for our listeners. Dr. Marcela Smid, thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me today.
Thanks so much.
This ends today's podcast. Thank you for listening to Addiction Medicine Beyond the Abstract. All of today's show links can be found in the show notes. Remember, you can preview additional abstracts at journalofaddictionmedicine.com. This program was produced by the American Society of Addiction Medicine.